Blitz basketball, like we were talking offline before, I kind of, when I wrote Crossover, which was kind of my first book in like 2005, uh, I got some people that were asking, like, how can I agree with the philosophy, but how can I implement it a little bit more specifically? And so Blitz basketball was kind of an attempt to give that, like, how can you take the basic philosophy of, developing, technical and tactical skills, physical skills, mental skills all together, and make it, I guess, a little bit more practical for players to, or for coaches to take, something directly to practice tonight, or directly into, the offense that they're going to run this season. And so, I wrote it in about 2006. It was based primarily on stuff that we did when I was coaching at Hoop Masters in Los Angeles, in like 2001. I think I coached a boys team, with Jerome Green, kind of oversaw us, because his son Pharaoh was on our team. And then it was myself and Ahmad were coaching. And this was kind of, the progression. I had come from coaching a college, being a college assistant coach, and I left that and came back to work with 9-year-olds, with Hoop Masters. And so when we started out, I was kind of the more the, college mindset and drills and individual workouts, and we got to improve individual fundamentals and things like that. And then as we went along, Jerome kept pushing me, and he was like, you need to play more, you need to play more, you need to play more. These are 9-year-olds, they need to play. They're not going to learn just by doing drills and stuff like that. So that's kind of how a lot of my basic philosophy developed, but also what this book is more or less based upon is the system of drills, and then ultimately the philosophy that we use to kind of develop players while we are trying to also, compete, and become a competitive AAU team, and we ultimately, went to AAU national championships, which I know seems kind of crazy that an under-9 team is going to a national tournament in Memphis, Tennessee, but, such is life. So our basic idea when we started out is, Hoop Masters was a, club that had teams all the way into high school, but, primarily from, under-9s through junior high, but into high school. And so, when we looked at it, we were like, as our one team, we don't need to teach every single skill, or make sure that we've, tried to master every single skill at this age group, because, we want to develop certain things. And then our under 10 coach can build on what we did as 9-year-olds. And then the 11-year-old coach can build on what we did as 10 years old and stuff like that. So the 4 things that we kind of thought, how can we, what can we actually master at this age group, with 9-year-olds, what can we master? And so that was ball handling, layups, on-ball defense. And then we just wanted players to learn how to play hard and learn how to be competitive. So that's kind of the foundation of what we were trying to do with the overall system. And then as we built the basic principles that the offense developed upon were kind of based on what I call my hard to guard mentality, which actually came from a book that I wrote for somebody else back in like 2002. And it was the idea that players are most open when they first receive a pass. One defender can't stop one offensive player. And then if you draw a second defensive player, that's when you need to find the open player. So offensively, those were kind of our 3 major things that we were trying to develop, both from a technical standpoint, a tactical standpoint, but really from a mindset standpoint of you can't let one defensive player guard you. So to have that mindset, you also have to have those skills. So that means playing a lot of one-on-one, playing a lot of 2-on-2, so we could develop the ball handling skills and making the layups, so that we really had that mindset that if we only see one defensive player in front of us, we're attacking that player. If we draw that second player, that's where we need to find, the open man. So the reason for, this specific system was, I'd come from, growing up as a player being, running flex when I was at this age. I didn't even play at this age, but, kind of my beginning years, from 5th to 8th grade, we always ran flex. And we spent so much time at practice just running 5-on-0 offense, 5-on-0 offense. And when we were running the offense, we weren't really doing anything to develop any kind of skills. And so, I understood that, in this environment, we wanted to have a competitive team. We needed to have some kind of organization that we could fall back on when we were in games, even though everybody pressed and most of the game was just, fast breaks and transition, but we needed to have something that we could fall back on and some kind of organization. And so the goal was that we could teach or develop technical skills, dribbling, shooting, passing, at the same time that we were kind of developing a very simple framework of an offense. And so that was kind of the idea behind this. Is all our 1-on-1, 2-on-0, 1-on-0, 2-on-0, 3-on-0 type drills. It was just building the basic kind of motion behind, our offense. And so, but at the end of the day, they were also shooting drills. They were layup drills. They were dribbling drills. They were passing drills. So we weren't just spending all our time running 5-on-0 offense and, in a non-competitive setting, but our non-competitive 5-on-0 offense basically was our technical work. It was getting up our shooting repetitions. It was getting, making passes off the dribble, jump stop, things like this. So along these lines, again, because we were initially working with 9-year-olds, it was important that our practices were active. And that was one of the biggest things is, we didn't want to have a lot of lines. We didn't want to have a lot of people standing around. We wanted offense and defense in every drill because that's how you play the game. And that's, ultimately why they were there. We were in an environment where we practiced twice a week, and by the time players got through Los Angeles traffic, we'd maybe have 90-minute practices. And so we wanted to get through as much as possible in a session. And so that meant less talking and it meant more, just playing and incorporating offense and defense in as many drills as possible. So again, we wanted lots of play. We wanted an environment for learning. And then we wanted it to be fun. Again, it's 9 years old. We wanted something the players enjoyed doing, enjoyed playing, and enjoyed coming to practice. We really wanted them to be there, wanted them to want to be there. So to me, 3 keys, and, this was back from 2006, 3 keys of developing successful players and successful teams is developing internal motivation, the desire to play, and a habit of playing hard. So again, those were 3 things that we were really trying to emphasize over and over. Is we wanted to, I think in Deci and Ryan's paper, the self-determination theory, they talk about, when you initially join an activity, you're already intrinsically motivated, right? You don't, you can argue nowadays that may or may not be true because parents are forcing kids to do things, and maybe, you sign up your child for sports at such a young age now that they really haven't even made the decision to play. But generally speaking, when you sign up for basketball, it's because you have an interest in basketball. You want to play basketball, you want to be on a team, you want to improve, et cetera, et cetera. So you already have an interest. You already have that intrinsic motivation. And so really what we're doing, it isn't so much as building intrinsic motivation as it is not turning that intrinsic motivation into extrinsic motivation. And so that means, we want to try to avoid punishment. We don't want players playing hard because, we're going to force them to run if they don't play hard. We want players playing hard because that's what they know, that's what they enjoy, that's what's fun, that's how they're getting better, and it's that kind of environment that continues and increases their intrinsic motivation as opposed to taking away from it. And then, just the desire to play. We wanted kids, we didn't want to have to force kids to come to practice. I've talked about it, the 2 players who, by the end of the year, one was Jerome's son, Pharaoh, and then another kid, David, they were the best ball handlers by the end of the year. And you would see them at the end of practice. Pharaoh's dad was in charge, so he was usually the one that had to lock the gym, so he had to wait for everybody to get out of the gym. And then David's mom was always talking to the coaches afterwards and talking to Jerome and organizing things. So they were usually the last 2 to leave. And you would see them, like I remember we practiced at, I think it's Hamilton High School in West LA. And, there's like a little kind of foyer outside the gym. And so we'd close the doors to the gym, and we'd be trying to push everybody outside the foyer, out onto the street. And, it was probably, 10 feet wide. And so as people were walking out, you'd see Pharaoh and David, and they'd be trying to get past each other just in this little, 10-foot area, and then we'd go outside on the sidewalk, and, the parents would still be talking or whatever. And you'd see David and Pharaoh, and they'd be trying to get by each other on the sidewalk, and stuff. And so, practice had ended. We'd already gone 2 hours. Pharaoh had probably been there even longer because his dad was in charge. And they just wanted to play. They just wanted to have fun. That's how they got better. And ultimately, that's how they were, almost impossible to take the ball off of them, because they spent so much time just doing this little one-on-one, just trying to get by each other in a really small area. And then again, the habit of playing hard. To us, that was one of the biggest things, is just, both coming down from the college level and working with children, and then just kind of watching the players who were good, at that age. And it was really just the players who played hard and were aggressive were the ones that were better. And to us, if we could just get players to be competitive, to play hard all the time, that was going to put them in the right kind of mind frame, and give them the right base to develop as they were moving forward, when they could develop their skills better. So finally, when I was developing these ideas, or when we were developing these ideas, basically I had 10 basic assumptions on which I based these. So the first one was that one-on-one in open space, the offense has the advantage. 2 is teams who make a lot of free throws win games. 3, when the defense is forced to scramble, more fouls are committed and more offensive rebounds are relinquished. We good?
Good. You're good, Coach.
Okay. Sorry. 4, offensive rebounds lead to fouls, points, and free throws. 5, turnovers are wasted possessions. 6, catching the ball already squared to the basket greatly improves a shooter's shooting percentages. 7, dribble penetration is the toughest action to defend. 8, most teams rely heavily on starters and see a drop off after their 4th or 5th player. So we were really trying to develop our full 10 or 12 person team, and then take advantage of the depth. 9, offensive players are ill-equipped to handle pressure for an entire game. And then 10, forcing players to make decisions at a faster pace leads to mistakes. So those were kind of the basic ideas, and especially at 9 and 10 years old. But I think those ideas, or those assumptions, carry forth almost all the way up through, professional basketball. So those are kind of the basics, especially if the, focus more on the offensive side of the system. So yeah, does anybody have any questions?
I'll start, Coach.
Okay.
I know you wrote it a long time ago, and now we're 2020, and the game's kind of changed, if you will, a little bit. How would it adapt? How would you change it to adapt to today? Would you keep it the same, or would you make tweaks and adjustments to what you were teaching back then?
I think to a certain extent, most of it would stay the same. I think it holds up pretty well over time. I think, how I would teach some of the specific skills I've probably evolved over time. I probably teach, how to use an on-ball screen, especially within a 5-person setup. I probably teach that a little bit differently. I would probably teach or try to develop a little bit more off-ball movement. And again, it depends on the age group that I'm working with. If I'm working with 9-year-olds, I think it probably fits to a certain extent. With college players, I would hopefully be able to evolve it a little bit more and add more wrinkles to make it a little bit more difficult. But I think most of the basic assumptions, like I said, and most of the things that I was trying to get, are things that I still believe in, in terms of, offensively, taking advantage of one-on-one situations, in terms of, I think if you catch the ball already square to the basket, you're going to be a better shooter than if you have to, come hard off a screen and catch and turn and face before you shoot, things like that. Defensively, if we can speed up teams and make them make decisions, quicker. I think that's to the defense's advantage. I think, I do think depth, if you can have quality depth, I think that does give you an advantage, because I do think teams will wear down if you can force pace on them. And I've seen that even to the college level, where as soon as teams try to go to their fourth or fifth option, they're in trouble, whereas we can, hopefully go 7 or 8, 9 deep, and not have too much of a drop off, from our best player to our ninth player, there's an obvious drop off, but, we can there's not a huge drop off from like our third to our sixth, or from our, fifth to our ninth, and so things like that, I think, so I think it holds up pretty well over time. Like I said, with older players, I would just evolve it a little bit more, and I probably teach, certain things a little differently now, just because of the way the game's changed.
Well, someone has your book, so they're asking a question. Some of the later chapters in Blitz, it talks about positions, types of players. Does this hold up in the modern positionless play?
We have a page number so I can see what I wrote.
He might. That's my boy, I think, in Australia that I was telling you about too.
Okay. Does he have a page number?
He's all, give me a second.
All right.
I'll give you a sec.
I'm trying to find it. My guess is no, but
I'm trying to remember too. Is your Army, is your Navy drill in Blitz?
Yeah, I believe so. Let's see. Okay, well, I just flipped through it. I can't find quickly what he's talking about, so I'll wait for the page number. But
well, so we got another A to Z course member here going. How much one-on-one would you do versus 2-on-2, 3-on-3? Do you like one?
I prefer 2-on-2 to 1-on-1, because I do play a lot of 1-on-1, but I think 2-on-2 is the best game, because it's the smallest number of players that you can have that incorporates every skill that you can use in the game. So I think 1-on-1 oftentimes can become unrealistic, because you don't have to worry about a help defensive player, and you never have the option of passing the ball, so you're strictly focused on the rim, which changes the way that you might, you might drive to the basket if you're potentially going to pass the ball, as opposed if well, I'm either going to shoot a jump shot or I'm going to shoot a layup. I know I have to shoot. So, when I'm working on 1-on-1, my players probably don't know it, but most of the time when we're playing 1-on-1, it's to work on defense. And then usually when we're playing 2-on-2, that's when we're focusing on offense a little bit more. And I would say we play 2-on-2 in every single practice. We probably play 3-on-3 in almost every single practice, and we play 5-on-5 in every single practice. 1-on-1, I would say we play in almost every single practice as well. That tends to be our position breakdown work is where we'll play 1-on-1. And again, it's, we score it offensively, but we're more working on the defense, or, in the post, we're working how we're going to deny our front in the post, whatever we're going to do. So, So I found the positions. I saw it up. I saw the note. So
in chapter 7.
Right. I think the positions hold up pretty well. Those are kind of the positions that I would use. I would probably put, I really like my point guard to be able to shoot threes. As you can see how, the NBA's evolved with guys like Curry and Dame and stuff like that. And over the last 3 years, my point guard's been a really good 3-point shooter. So I'd probably, maybe look for that a little bit more. But yeah, a point guard who can make plays, a combo guard who can score and ideally shoot threes, a shooting guard who can shoot threes, a bigger fourth guard. I think that's more or less how basketball has gone now is, your power forward is almost more of a guard than a post player on most teams now. So, and then fifth, a strong finisher who can catch the ball around the basket. I think that's important. I'd like my center now to be a shooter as well, but beggars can't be choosers. But if possible, I think those fit pretty well, and that tends to be kind of what I look for. And if I could find a 5 who can do those things and shoot the ball, that's even better. And if I can find a 1 that can do those things and shoot the ball, that's even better. But the rest of them fit pretty well. You could look at our teams, and to a large extent, you would say that we play 4 guards.
This is a really good question, Brian, from Chris. How would you compare or contrast this system with the 5-out pass and cut style for youth players? What would be the major advantage in switching to your philosophy and or the drawbacks?
I think it just depends on what you want to emphasize. I think this might be easier for younger children just because I just think dribbling's easier than passing. For young players, maybe that's just because that's what I tend to emphasize. So that's what I end up with that, as a result. But I think trying to get a 5-out, the other thing, and I see this, I've meant to write about this, at the NBA level, but, I think the playoffs have really shown the problems with the 5-out system that doesn't put pressure on the rim. And so if your 5-out system, isn't putting pressure on the rim with cutters or, rollers to the basket off screens, I think it becomes easy to guard. I think the better teams in the playoffs, like the Heat, you may not think of them as a 5-out team, but, when they have Bam, he's usually playing in the high post. He's in dribble handoffs, so, excuse me, to me, that's kind of a 5-out or at least a 4-out with a high post as opposed to some kind of post player action. So, but they're always putting pressure with cutters or rolling to the rim hard, and breaking down the defense in that way. So, I think in 5-out, when everybody stays wide and you don't put enough pressure on the rim, I think you become easy to guard. And so I think, with something like Blitz, I think you're putting a little bit more pressure on the rim constantly. Now, obviously, that depends on how you run your 5-out and stuff like that. But so I do know that there is a definite portion of the population who is in favor of just passing and cutting for young players, and I can definitely see that as being valuable. So I don't want to say one's way is better than the other. I just kind of think that the way that youth basketball is played here, this system fits with the way that we tend to play basketball with youth players, whether that's good or bad. We may be contributing to the problem, but I just think that it fits, at least in all my experiences, it fits with, the kind of defenses that you play against and the types of players that you start with initially. Because to me, as much as we don't want winning to matter at youth ages, and I don't really care so much whether my team wins or loses, players need to feel successful. And whether that's individually successful or team, if you're on a team where you're, losing every game, getting killed every game, as much as your coach tries to build you up and as much as, that's not really that important. And at the end of the day, it does become discouraging, and I say that as somebody who probably the most fun I had on a team, in Little League baseball, I think we maybe won one game all year one year, but we were all good friends and we had fun, but, the following year when we won TOC champs, that was more fun, so I think you can have fun being on a bad team, and you can still persist and play and motivate players and all those things if you do it right. But I think it's easier to feel like you're improving, and I think it's easier to maintain that intrinsic motivation and and drive that interest and encourage players, you know, to continue to work hard if they start to see some success, whether that's individual success or team success.